Hello and welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 FM. I'm Paul Kretschmer. The second of 2 days of a visit with Roger D. Blackwell, Ph.D., a man who went from teaching as many as 65,000 students over the years at Ohio State University to a prison term for inside trading of securities.
I had to make a new life. Wheaton College was one of the few schools that gave me an opportunity to be a lecturer again after prison. And I have taught at other schools, and I now teach in business seminars around the country quite a bit. But people don't realize a felony conviction is a penalty for life. It's something that's always there. And many of the jobs I've been offered, when I published books before, and before this book, I published 39 books. One of them sold 1 million copies, a textbook that's used all over the world in about a dozen languages, and it's just used in Russia, in Russian, in Japan, in Japanese, and so forth. And I published books that sold a lot of copies and everything. But when I got out, the publishers said, no, we can't have a felon. And so it just happened that Richard Simmons III, you may have read about him or read some of his books, was being published by Union Hill, a Birmingham, Alabama publisher that publishes Christian books. And they asked me to help them adapt one of his books for prison ministries because they had a lot. And I had experience. And so I did. And in the process, they said, what are you working on now? I said, well, I'm thinking about a book that I started in prison about how to start a business. And in prison, I taught GED courses mostly, but I also taught a course on how to get a job when you get out. And people in prison would say, hey, Blackwell, nobody's going to hire me because I've got a felony conviction. And I would say, you're probably right. Most people won't. But why don't you give a job to yourself? And they'd say, what do you mean by that? And so I said, well, start your own business. It can be lawn care, painting houses. It can be fixing cars. It can be all kinds of things. But you start your own business. Give yourself a job. And they said, I don't know how to do that. So I wrote a book called Saving America, how garage entrepreneurs grow small firms into large fortunes. And I gave examples like Sam Walton, who didn't even start his business until he was 45 years old.
That's right.
And he graduated from the University of Missouri, but he was basically a paper carrier and a Missouri farm kid, which I was too. And I also talk about Steve Jobs and Dave Thomas, who never knew their birth fathers. And Dave Thomas never knew his birth father. Steve Jobs did, but both adopted. And I actually worked for Dave Thomas quite a bit, and he started a little firm and named it after his daughter called Wendy's. A lot of people don't know that he didn't go past the 10th grade, and he was not what people sometimes would call educated, but he had common sense. And in fact, his daughter Wendy, who he named the restaurant chain for, helped me write the chapter about Dave Thomas in this book, Saving America. And Union Hill, which is normally just publishes Christian books, published that book, and it's been quite successful. And so later they said, Roger, why don't you do a book that's more about evangelism? And this new book is called You Are Not Alone, which is the story of my life, and what parents can learn in raising children that I learned from my parents. And they said, one of the things, we hope that it'll be evangelistic. So the last chapter of this book includes the prayer that Billy Graham has used all over the world and invites people to become a Christian. I consider this more valuable than books the 39 previous books I've written about how to make money and grow your businesses. And it's on my website, which is rogerblackwellbusiness.com. Both books are described, but if somebody wants to think, if they have children growing up, I think they would like this book. Or one of the early readers said she's buying it for her daughter because her daughter has resisted becoming a Christian. And this is an evangelistic book. And the last chapter invites people to become a Christian. But I also talk about how to get an education without costing your parents money. My parents were very poor. They never paid $1 for my education, and I never had any debt when I graduated, and yet I got a good education, including a PhD from Northwestern.
You've given us quite an overview of your life and experiences, Roger. Could you describe for listeners the point at which you actually made a profession of faith in Jesus Christ and how you felt about it when it happened for you?
Well, I had the great advantage of having parents who taught me not only how to work, but they took me to church. But when I was 16, I started working as a janitor in a radio station. And then I started working as the weekend radio person, 10 and 12-hour shifts on Saturday and Sunday, because those, on Sunday at least, were mostly starting back to the Bible and ETs that all you had to do is just give a station ID and start the next tape or ET. And I drifted away. And then in college, I took history courses in which they said there is no God. And they convinced me that God is not something that created us, but we created the idea of God. And I would have described myself as an atheist, and I was not active in church or anything. And then, when I went to graduate school, they can read the book on how I became a Christian, but I was actually sitting in engineering school in Dallas, Texas, and Dr. Criswell gave a sermon. And at the end of it, he gave an invitation and said, accept Christ. Everybody stood up and sang a song at the end of the service, except me. I sat there and thought, wait a minute, my history professors are wrong. And if God really does exist, I should invite him into my heart and take control. And I did then. Now, I never really understood the logical, what you would call apologetics, reasons why God exists until I got in graduate school and studied Bayesian statistics. And then I read books by Bonhoeffer, and C.S. Lewis was instrumental. One of his books was about prayers from prison, and I had read that before I went to prison, but I sent letters to my friends outside using the same format that Bonhoeffer did. And now I'm a big fan of Tim Keller and other people who I consider apologetics is one of the most interesting things. It takes too much faith to be an atheist, and I learned that. Yeah.
If you had something that you would appreciate people praying for on your behalf as you continue your life and work, what would it be? Would you like to invite people to pray for you about something specific at this point in our conversation?
I would pray that I continue to have the health to teach. I now know that God had the plan and purpose for me to be a teacher, and I resisted that and I was going to be a lawyer, and I describe how I got out of that and into being a teacher. And I'm 80 years old, but I'm still teaching. I was teaching this last week in Milwaukee for most of the week. And, at 80, you begin to wonder, do you really have the strength and the wisdom to do that? And I would pray that opportunities to teach would fulfill the purpose that God has for my life. And frankly, I'm working on a new book that I think would solve a lot of the problems in our nation. It's on behavioral economics. But I have the problem. It's not a book that Christian publishers would want to publish. And I don't know whether I'll get a publisher that was interested in that, because it's something that extreme Democrats and extreme Republicans probably don't think about. And it's the answers to America's economic problems. I started that in my Saving America book. So if they want something specific to pray that I'd get a publisher for my book that I'm working on now.
And on that note, we conclude. And once again, thanks for your conversation with me.
Thank you.
My guest has been Roger D. Blackwell, Ph.D., author of the book You Are Not Alone, about his life. For further information, call us at 860-346-1049. That's 860-346-1049. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Paul Kretschmer on the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 WIHS.